First, I'd like to thank the tens of thousands of viewers for taking the time to watch Hunting the Hound of Cold Hollow, and the hundreds who've posted comments and sent emails and even shared reports of their own encounters with werewolves and dogmen. I had no idea that this phenomenon was so widespread, so I hope my little small contribution to the discussion has been of value to some of you. For those of you who don't know this story or haven't seen Hunting the Hound of Cold Hollow, it's a short video I created based on my time working as a freelance journalist, covering a story about a string of disappearances that have taken place over a long history in northern Vermont and Quebec, and about a werewolf legend attached to those disappearances. But I'd like to stress an important detail here about the work. As a journalist, I feel it's really important to emphasize that my story is about a werewolf legend, not about the existence of a real werewolf. There seems to be a bit of confusion about that. So I want to emphasize that as a journalist, the story I'm telling is a story about the belief and the circumstances surrounding a legend, and not about the existence or non-existence of werewolves or dogmen or any other cryptozoological phenomenon. The myths, the legends, are real. For example, I can tell you the story of Little Red Riding Hood, where it comes from, how it's evolved, and I could probably even find some people who believe that it's a true story. The story of Little Red Riding Hood is real. You can see it on a page, you can hold it in your hands, and it says something about the people, the time, the place from which it came. In that sense, myths, legends, these things are, the stories are real, even if the characters and the events that take place in the stories are figments of the imagination of their creators. The same goes for Hunting the Hound of Cold Hollow. I'm telling you about a myth, a belief, a rumor regarding a werewolf. I am not telling you that werewolves are real. But likewise, I'm not telling you that werewolves are pure fiction. I'm not taking a side on the existence of werewolves or dogmen. I'm simply relaying to you a story that there are those who believe in the existence of these things, and that, as a journalist, is my interest. I'm going to leave it to others to discuss the science or pseudoscience or metaphysics behind those myths and beliefs. While on the subject of storytelling, I'd also like to remind everybody that this was all based around a report that I had published through Playboy. And it's been brought to my attention by one viewer that the article is listed in web caches, but you can find traces of it through Google, but there seems to be no active link to the original article through Playboy's website or anywhere else. So I'm going to see if I can't get that back online for everybody. But in the meantime, what I'd like to do is satisfy the request from several of my viewers to read the original article that was published in Playboy on Halloween of 2016. I've also created a little piece of original music to accompany my reading, just to kind of help set the mood. But one last detail I'd like to mention before going any further. The title of the original article was the idea of former Playboy editor Joe Donatelli, not mine. So, without further ado, I hope you enjoy this reading of Werewolves Are Definitely Not Real, ... right? Werewolves Are Definitely Not Real, right? By J.D. Thompson, October 30th, 2015. In 1994, Jack Nicholson played the character Will Randall, a Manhattan book editor who was attacked by a wolf in rural Vermont, causing him to later transform into a werewolf. As much as we may love Nicholson and his wolf co-star Michelle Pfeiffer, the only thing truly scary about the movie was how bad it was. But just as every piece of good fiction is built on a kernel of truth, so too is bad fiction, it seems. Of course there's no such thing as werewolves, we all know that. But according to some, Randy Quaid isn't the only hairy creature crossing the Canadian border into Vermont. In 2006, a woman named Tanya reported spotting not one, not two, but 3 werewolves chasing her car as she drove through a more heavily populated area of the state. Folklorist Joe A. Citro described the report in his handy companion, The Vermont Monster Guide. As the story goes, Tanya was driving home one night, quote, when she caught motion at the side of the road. She slowed down some more, not wanting to collide with some family pet. What she saw was like a house pet from hell. An enormous 4-legged animal was loping alongside her car. Occasionally it would leer at her face to face as she looked back. It wasn't a dog, she knew that right away, but what was it? Tanya is convinced she was pursued by a pack of northern Vermont werewolves, Citro says. Based on Citro's research, one might conclude that werewolves are rare in Vermont but not necessarily new. He notes one of the first recorded sightings was reported by F. Barrows Colton in National Geographic magazine in May of 1951. According to Colton, he, his father, and a logger named Joe LeBlanc went on a hunting trip near Groton Pond. Colton says LeBlanc disappeared and, quote, finally turned up at a nearby sawmill village with a wild look in his eyes. In the woods, he had seen the awful loup-garou and had got out of there fast. It was during a completely unrelated bit of reporting that I came across another, more recent werewolf story, where a young woman from the same area allegedly left her place of work in the early morning hours and, like the logger LeBlanc, vanished into the woods. The young woman was never found. Out of respect, I'll not rehash some of the more sordid details of her disappearance, but I can say with certainty that the Vermont State Police are not interested in any paranormal explanations involving werewolves or other shapeshifters. I had to look elsewhere for some insight into the rumors and their basis in local lore. I asked Joe Citro about the reports, but he said after 2006 the trail of the werewolf went cold. Quote, I did a lot of research and put the call out to a lot of people. There must be some kind of conspiracy of silence, Joe Citro says. I mean, if your neighbor is a werewolf, it might not be wise to make it known, you know? Just a few miles from the most recent disappearances, another local resident, Melinda, offered a hypothesis. She suggests that the reason it's tough to track down the source of the werewolf legend is due to the fact that the creature being reported is a shapeshifter, an aberration caused by interdimensional beings from a lower plane of existence, or someone who is entering into that dimension. Yeah. Melinda is a dowser, someone who attenuates herself with, quote, earth energies, end quote, and through the use of a special stick called a dowsing rod locates everything from water to gold, from oil to missing persons. Quote, I think what you might call shape-shifting exists in all cultures, but the way people perceive it can be vastly different, she says. Melinda focuses on more of the paranormal elements with her dowsing, searching for ghosts and performing clearings, a sort of ritual where she and others from the area contact the dead and help them pass into their allotted dimension. Melinda, however, is only but one of the many dowsers in the region. Vermont is home to the nation's foremost organization, the American Society of Dowsers, Incorporated. Being something of a resident expert on all things paranormal, I asked Melinda how she would explain the elusive Vermont werewolf. Quote, there are different dimensions sandwiched on top of each other, but instead of werewolves being of a higher awareness, it's a lower awareness. Melinda says, quote, perceptions of werewolves and these things we see as terrible, they are part of the first or second dimension energies. Stay with me now. Here's where the cosmology gets really interesting. According to Melinda, each sliver of energy has a unique energy profile. From this worldview, she argues that those who perceive energies as werewolves or believe they have experienced werewolf transformations themselves are not necessarily lying and are not necessarily crazy. They are simply experiencing an interdimensional overlap at which, for whatever reason, the person encountering the werewolf is either witnessing an interdimensional transformation or is experiencing a slide into a lower dimensional consciousness themselves. Quote, It's real hard not to spook yourself when you believe other people when they say they've seen werewolves, she says. It's hard not to go, oh no, I hope that doesn't happen to me. But that person's experience is theirs, and theirs alone. If you fear that, you'll be drawn into that energy. I asked Joe Citro for his thoughts on the paranormal in general and if he believes in werewolves. His answer? Well, I'm still sitting on that same old fence. You don't have to be a believer to love the stories. The fact is, I don't spend much time thinking about werewolves. They've never really become part of local culture. Ghost stories are a dime a dozen, but as I found out, you have to look pretty damn hard to find a werewolf story in Vermont. My suspicion, they're all up in Quebec. And so I continued my line of inquiry, and as it turns out, Citro was right. If there are werewolves in the United States, we can blame Canada. Now, it's not like Vermont is suddenly experiencing a plague of werewolves, but Citro admits that there's something lurking out there in the forests of the Green Mountains. Quote, I think most people who concern themselves with such things suspect it was a Bigfoot-like creature. There have been a lot of alleged Bigfoot sightings in that neck of the woods, but that's explaining one unknown with another unknown. I've written a good deal about Bigfoot in Vermont. Many, many more Bigfoot sightings than werewolf encounters, says Citro. At the end of my short investigation, I was left with the following facts. For over a century, people in the mountains of rural Vermont have been disappearing without a trace. Only a few cases have been closed with enough evidence pointing to foul play to pursue prosecutions. But most of the recent instances of young women disappearing remain unsolved. Some blame the mystical shapeshifter of Native American legend called Skinwalker. Others fear the cycle of the werewolf and the French-Canadian loup-garou, viewing them as interdimensional beings crossing over into our plane of existence to drag lost souls into the depths. Citro, who takes a more scholarly and historical view of lore and legend, seems to think that werewolf sightings can be simply attributed to some wild imaginations and the return of wild wolves to the area due to Vermont's effective conservation initiatives. But whatever people are seeing, or claim to be seeing, something unusual is howling during the full moon, and people are intermittently disappearing without a trace. What can be done to stop interdimensional beings from trespassing into our plane of consciousness? How do we keep werewolves from illegally crossing the border from Canada? Vermont may be home to presidential hopeful Bernie Sanders, but obviously, these paranormal border problems seem more like a job for the keen mind of Donald Trump.